So welcome everybody. This is a minimal introduction to the metadata schema of NOMAD called NOMAD MetaInfo. And this introduction is a useful gateway to the notebook querying the archive and performing artificial intelligence modeling. Now, it is interesting to start by saying what are metadata. So in general, metadata are data about data, and in order to understand what exactly, why they are useful, one has to have the concept of data object. It is also called information resource. And you can imagine it as a row in a data table. And here I produce an example that is a kind of sketchy way to represent some computation, some ab initio computation. So you have some identifier of your row in the table, and then you have performed a calculation on some structure that is stored in some file called graphite.xyz. And then the calculation has been performed with some method, some obscure abbreviation to some, not so much obscure to others, so density functional theory, some specific exchange correlation functional, and one has calculated, for example, the total energy of that structure. So the columns of this table are called attributes of the data objects, and the whole row is one data object. Now, these attributes can be called data or metadata depending on the context. So here now I colored differently what is supposed to be metadata in this context and what is data, and I also add a new column saying that, for example, in the calculation one has also produced a new structure, for example, by calculating forces on the atoms and then propagating, relaxing these forces or doing some molecular dynamics, and so you have a new structure. Just to show that something that looks similar it can be metadata or data depending on specific context. So for this specific calculation, this specific data object, graphite.xyz is the metadata, and the data, so what is calculated is graphite_2, but this graphite_2 can be metadata to another calculation, so then to another data object. Furthermore, you will have administrative metadata, something about where the data are, who has access privileges, who has calculated in the case of computational material science, when, on which computer, and so on. And in general, how the calculation came about. So if it is part of some complex workflow, it should be also annotated. So in general, to give a definition that is useful for especially for computational material science and then also experimental, metadata are the attributes that are necessary to locate, fully characterize, and ultimately reproduce other attributes that are identified as data. The metadata include a clear and unambiguous description of the data and their full provenance. So the provenance is this concept that is related to the how the data came about. This said, let's focus a little bit on a computation, having in mind atomistic kind of calculations, and they say that an atomistic simulation code is a kind of black box. Here you have the black box, and it has for sure a name. There's some versions, some libraries for the compilation of the code that was used for doing the actual calculation. Then you have some input structure, coordinates and information on the supercell and so on. And then you have an input model, the physics. So what kind of exchange correlation, for example, treatment, relativity, and then the numerical issues related to the calculation itself. And then you have some output. You have calculated total energies, forces, and many other things. And so you see that all these concepts, all these items organize logically in tables. And this is the idea that we exploit in designing the NOMAD MetaInfo. So you see that in order to have somewhat the data, so the output, you have families, tables of metadata, and it's useful to organize them in this way. So jumping directly to how MetaInfo was designed, now that you have seen this structure in tables, so we just kind of mapped this into a logical representation that goes back to these tables and items in tables. So we have types of metadata, and the most important one are the type section that essentially map the tables, and the type quantity that map the items in the table. So the columns, in this case, the attributes that I start with, where the rows in the table would be the actual data object actually. So it is important that, for example, one has a kind of standard representation in terms of, for example, the units that are used in order that there is no confusion when the data are stored. Okay, so here is once more the same representation in terms of tables and items in the table, but this time I used as a header the names of the actual section metadata that we have in NOMAD MetaInfo that you will find by browsing the actual NOMAD archive. So this whole short introduction was to give an idea why we have this section kind of metadata and then this quantity kind of metadata. There is many more kind of metadata, but this is what you need to start to understand what's going on. Indeed, in the notebook, you will be presented in the very first cell with a query to the archive, and this is nothing else than a way to access the archive by means of the metadata. So there will be a metadata code name and the specific value that is queried for, some specific crystal system, the structure contains an atom, oxygen, possibly others, and so on. And then this is what is required in order to do the query, so the filter that singles out the data that are needed, and then you have another section here of the query in which you say what you actually want out of the data that you have queried for in order to perform the analysis, as you will see in the notebook. So this kind of query is essentially the same that you can do on the GUI that was introduced by Marcus in the previous hands-on session. And once you have done your search via the GUI, you click the button, this bracket thing, and then you are presented with the code that you can paste in your notebook in order to do exactly the same query. Now, this is the tip of the iceberg, or the tip of the iceberg. In order to browse the complex structure and in a rich variety of metadata that we have in NOMAD MetaInfo, the only way is to go again from the GUI to the MetaInfo tab, and then you see there is much more, but I already hinted here, give a suggestion. So if you go to Entry Archive, section Run, you find essentially the things that I've talked about till now. That is what you need to perform searches on calculations that are in the NOMAD archive. So have fun with the notebook and further queries. This is it for now. Thank you for your attention.